There is a conversation I have not had with you yet, and I need to have it, because it is the part people skip in stories like this one. The part that sits between the romantic beginning and the redemptive ending, and does not photograph well. It is the part about what it actually costs to live inside a class gap, when the feeling of being in love is real, but the daily friction of two different formations is also real. And both things are true at the same time, and no amount of sincerity resolves that. Danny grew up in a 3-bedroom house in Kenosha, with 2 parents who both worked, and a brother who still lives 4 blocks from where they all grew up. His family takes care of things themselves: repairs, moves, problems. They do not hire people for things they can do. And the idea of hiring people for things they can do but don't want to is not laziness to them. It is waste. And waste is a moral category in the Kowarski household. The way it is in a lot of families where the margin was never wide enough for comfort to be casual. I grew up in Barrington with a housekeeper named Mrs. Novak, who came Tuesdays and Fridays, and a landscaping service, and a man named Phil who serviced the cars. Not because my father was lazy, because his time cost more than Phil's time, and the math was simple. I had absorbed this entirely without knowing I had absorbed it. The first time Danny and I had a real argument, not a surface disagreement, a real one, it was about the apartment. 6 weeks after we got married, the dishwasher started making a noise it had not made before, and I called our building manager and asked them to send someone to look at it. Danny came home while the maintenance guy was still there, and afterward, after the maintenance guy left and the dishwasher had been pronounced fine with a loose spray arm, Danny said, "You could have just looked at it yourself." Not unkind, not accusatory. A statement of fact, the way a man states facts, when the fact seems obvious. I said, "I didn't know how to look at it." He said, "I would have shown you." I said, "I know," but he was already coming for something in 3B. And I watched something small and unreadable cross his face and go quiet. I thought about that look for 2 days before I asked him about it. He was honest because he is always honest, which is one of the things that makes him difficult, in the best possible way. He said, "I am not bothered by calling the maintenance man. I am bothered that it did not occur to you to try first. And I am bothered that I am bothered by it, because it is a dishwasher, and it is not important." He said, "I think I need to figure out what I actually believe about things like that, because I don't want to spend our whole life being quietly annoyed by things that don't actually matter, and I also don't want to pretend I don't notice them when I do." That conversation took 3 hours, and it was one of the most clarifying 3 hours of my adult life. Because what we were actually talking about was not a dishwasher. We were talking about the entirely different set of assumptions we each walked into every room carrying. The invisible structure built by decades of different economic realities, and the question of how 2 people build a shared life when their architectures are that different. We did not resolve it that night. We have not fully resolved it in 2 years of marriage. What we have done is something I think is actually better. We have made it explicit. We talk about it when it comes up, without letting it calcify into resentment. Then you will say, that's a Barrington reflex, when I reach for a solution that involves calling someone, and I will say, noted, and either try it myself or be honest that I genuinely cannot and would rather not, and accept the mild eyebrow that comes with it. I will say, that's a Kenosha calculation, when he decides not to repair something because it is too expensive, and I have access to money that he does not, and the repair would matter to me, and I would like to pay for it. And he has learned, slowly and with effort on his part, that I do not undervalue, to let me sometimes, without treating it as a deficit in himself. We are both, I think, becoming people neither of us was before. That is not comfortable. It is very much worth it. My father and I had a conversation about Denny about 4 months into my depot visits, when the surgery recovery was going well enough that my father had started thinking again, rather than just enduring. It was not the apology conversation. It was earlier than that, and harder, and in some ways more important. He asked me, what does he want? Meaning Denny. Meaning, what does a man who drives a truck and owns his own rig and has no apparent interest in the infrastructure of wealth want from a marriage to a woman who has had wealth her whole life? I said, he wants a life that is his. He wants to do work he is good at and go home at the end of it to a person who means something to him. My father said, and the money doesn't... He stopped and started again. He doesn't feel it between you? The difference? I said, he feels it. We both feel it. We talk about it when we need to. It doesn't run us. My father was quiet for a while. Then he said something I was not expecting. Something I have turned over many times since. I have spent 30 years terrified that money was the only thing holding my world together. I am not sure I ever allowed myself to find out whether that was true. He did not say more. I did not push. But I understood that day that his fear about me marrying Denny was not entirely about Denny. It was about the possibility that a man who did not need what my father had built could also not need my father, and that my father had spent so long building things that would make people need him that he had forgotten how to trust that anyone might simply want him. That is a sad thing to understand about your father. It is also a clarifying one. The brake incident, which is what I call it in my own mind, had a longer tail than I described. The Romeoville maintenance shop lost the contract. My father reviewed the company's entire fleet maintenance protocol and discovered 2 other vendors whose certification procedures were insufficiently rigorous, and both contracts were restructured. Gerald, who had told the drivers the trucks were fine, received what my father described to me as a very serious conversation, and did not repeat the error. 3 drivers who had flagged the issue before the assessment were formally recognized in a company-wide memo, the first time in 8 years my father had used that mechanism. I asked my father why he was doing that, the memo, the recognition. He said, "Because Danny pointed out to me, not in those words, that the people who knew were the people who spent time in the trucks, and I had built a reporting structure that went around them instead of through them." He paused. "That is an expensive structure to maintain." He said it like a cost analysis, but what he meant was something closer to a regret, and I let it be what it was. The second Christmas after the surgery, my father asked Danny and me to bring Kes. Kes Kowalski is Danny's older brother and is one of the most genuinely strange people I have ever had the pleasure of knowing. He is 6'4" and works in industrial HVAC and has enormous hands and a very dry wit that arrives without any warning, and a habit of bringing exactly the right bottle of wine to any occasion, despite claiming to know nothing about wine. He and Danny are close in the way of brothers who were each other's primary company during difficult years, which means they communicate in half sentences and sideways references, and they can sit in the same room for 3 hours in perfect, comfortable silence. My father had met Kes once briefly, the day Danny showed him the truck. He had asked Danny about his brother, and Danny had said Kes was good people, which is the fullest endorsement Danny gives anyone. My father called and said, "Bring him to Christmas." I asked Danny, and Danny said, "He'll say he can't make it, and then he'll show up with wine," which is exactly what happened. My father and Cass sat together after dinner for 2 hours and talked about HVAC systems and warehouse design, and Cass's theory about why most commercial loading docks were designed by people who had never worked a loading dock, which is a theory he holds with the passionate conviction of a man who has spent 20 years correcting the mistakes of people who had never worked a loading dock. My father, who had built 4 warehouses in his career and had opinions about loading docks, was entirely absorbed. My mother and I cleaned up the kitchen and listened to the two of them go back and forth, and she looked at me at one point and said, "Your father is happy." Not in the performed way he could sometimes be happy, the host at his own party happy. Genuinely, sitting across from a man he would never have allowed into this room 14 months ago, arguing about the optimal placement of hydraulic dock levelers. I told Danny later that night in the car. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Cass does that. He just talks to people like they're people. I said, "Your father built a company on that, didn't he?" Danny glanced over and said, "Yeah." A pause. Shame it took this long. I thought about that the whole drive home. There is a version of this story where my father becomes a different man entirely, where pride dissolves into humility and he embraces everything he resisted, and we all live within the warm radius of a family that has healed. That is not the story I have. And I want to be honest with you about that, because I think the cleaned-up version is a kind of lie that makes real people feel like the real families are failing. My father still sometimes says things that close a door. He does it less than he did. He catches himself more often than he used to, and occasionally, in the catching, he says something different than he would have said 2 years ago. That is real progress. It is not completion. He will probably never be entirely comfortable with what my life looks like, because it doesn't look like what he built it to look like. And what my father built has always mattered enormously to him. But I stopped needing it to look like what he built. That is the actual thing that changed. Not him, not primarily. Me. Something in that parking garage with the white dress and the phone call and the man waiting 40 feet away with the patience of someone who had spent 6 years in the quiet of empty highways. Something in that moment finished forming. I stopped being a daughter trying to earn approval and became a woman who had decided what she actually valued and was willing to stand in front of the person who mattered most to her and say, "This is it. This is what I am choosing." You can be in it or not. That choice is available to every person reading this. The cost of making it varies wildly, and I do not want to understate mine or overstate my father's eventual accommodation of it. Some fathers do not come back. Some families do not find their way to Christmas with the right wine and the loading dock argument and the small real laugh on the front steps. I got lucky in ways I am not entitled to. My father loved me more than he loved his certainty, and it took a surgery and a man who knew where to look at a brake system to give him a context where he could actually show that. But the choice was still mine to make. And I made it in a parking garage in October, with the fluorescent lights flickering and a man in a work jacket waiting with his arms crossed and his whole posture saying, "Whenever you're ready." Danny asked me once. We were driving because the important conversations in our life tend to happen when we are driving. What I would have done if my father had never come around. If the surgery had happened and I had gone to Barrington and nothing had shifted and he had remained exactly the man he was in that parking garage. I sat with the question for a while, which he let me do. I said, I would have been sad about it for a long time, and I would have kept building what we have, and I would have made peace with the distance eventually, because I would have had to. And I would have loved him from that distance, the way you love someone who can't reach you anymore. Danny nodded. I said, but I wouldn't have gone back, not the way I used to be. He said, no, you wouldn't. Not a question. We drove for a while, and the highway went long and gold in front of us. And I thought about the girl who had stood in that parking garage in a white dress she bought on her lunch break, and made a choice that cost her everything she had been prepared to inherit. And I thought about what she had been handed instead, a man with an atlas on a diner counter, and a way of seeing what was wrong before it became the kind of wrong that couldn't be walked back. Some inheritances are not on paper. Some of them do not come in banker's boxes with the handwriting of someone you have loved your whole life. Some of them arrive in a parking lot on a cold night, wearing a work jacket, leaning against a truck with the patience of the long road in their whole body, waiting while you choose. I chose. I would choose it again, every single time. If you've made it all the way here, thank you, truly. Drop the word Atlas in the comments if you found your person in a place you weren't expecting. I read every single one, and the ones that find me late at night, when I'm on the road with Danny, are the reason I keep telling these stories. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs it, and go call the person who's been waiting.